The buildings were squat and dark. Green moss lay heavily on the huts' roofs and drooped to the ground around their sides. Large black mushrooms dotted the tops. Turkey tails fanned out from the sides. Crude fences of rotten logs made a maze around Winterwort. They seemed poor defense from the swamp that had swallowed the village. The lack of a church made Terran uncomfortable as they rode through the center of town. But the people greeted Carl with usual pleasantry. Offers of ale, bread, sausage, and fresh cuts of meat were valiantly and enthusiastically sold to the knight. He purchased a few, though less now that they had been away from Hawkroost for so long. In the week it took them to get to Winterwort, Nora outgrew all of her clothes. That, or she accidentally tore them. She had been hiding in her box for nearly 3 days. She still scratched on it to let Terran know she was all right. Carl led them past the village, through brambles and great berry bushes. The path was barely visible under the roots as it weaved around puddles and through thorny bushes. Finally, they came to a clearing. On one end was a stack of bones around a willow tree. The willow was carved heavily with twisted pagan symbols. It was a wonder the tree still lived. On the opposite side of the clearing, an ancient hovel with round windows and arched doors. The mound of moss and warty mushrooms dwarfed the other huts. Its chimney belched smoke in coughing bursts. The sun was below the horizon, but its light still turned the clouds pink. An old woman burst out of the hut, coughing and hacking up a storm. Smoke billowed from the open portal. Her arms had the same look as old boards, cracked and withered gray. Her skin hung loose about her face as her many, many layers of drab blue clothing. Trinkets in the dozen, including a silver cross, bounced on her chest.
"Damn the bloody chimney sweep! You were supposed to be here last week!"
The cracked voice spoke with such noise that Terran had to cover his ears.
"Oh, my apologies, good sir,"
she said, seeing Carl.
Cade?
Carl, ma'am. This is Terran. Terran, this is Madame Vickle. Terran bowed his head and said, "Ma'am?"
Right. It is quite late, dearie. Do you mind?
I do. Business of my nature must be done at such a time.
Ah, I see. What ails you, then?
I would like you to tell me the age of this girl. He patted the box. Unfortunately, she will want some privacy. The old woman looked over her shoulder into her home.
I see.
The walls were covered in thick carpets and drying herbs. A single table and 2 chairs sat in the middle, with a bed by the fire in the back. Dozens of little trinkets and charms and tinctures were strewn about. Most looked rather foul. Terran set down the box, and Carl pulled him out of the hovel. A moment later, a man rushed into the clearing. His hair was a frazzled mop. His features and figure was thin as a stave. He held a chimney cleaner. The man promptly clambered atop the roof and began his work. Shortly afterward, the witch returned with Nora in tow. Nora wore some of the witch's clothes, which were starting to look like they would be short for her shortly.
She appears healthy for a 14-year-old, a bit malnourished. I do suspect you know about the vampirism, seeing how central they are to your line of work. A quite well-behaved girl, I must say.
14? Taryn squeaked.
That's right. I'm older than you by 2 months.
No, you're not. Just because you're physically 14 doesn't stop the fact that you're still 12.
Ah, I see now, the woman exclaimed. An interesting occurrence, this. Perhaps her vampiric regeneration considers her physical age an ailment. Or perhaps the curse simply sees regrowth and growth as the same thing.
Nora, how is your hunger? Asked Carl.
I think a few more weeks is doable.
I believe it makes sense to have you wait here for 2 to 3 weeks, as your clothing will be impossible to deal with. If you would prefer, we could travel back to Hawk Roost first. But I believe you will be full-grown in a handful of weeks. I have a plan to get you vampire blood that I would also like to try. Nora thought for a minute. She whispered to Vickle. The old woman nodded.
I do like leather. The hunters bring me hides frequently. It's far harder to tear than linen. Also, I would enjoy having a further look into your condition. It is rather interesting.
I think that would be best. It's not like I'm getting any practice locked in a box,
said Nora. 9 days later, a vampire's head toppled to the ground. Taryn grasped the tottering corpse and slammed it into Nora's vacated box. The head stuck itself to the side of the box. Its jaw worked silently, and its eyes slowly glazed over.
Ah, it worked,
Carl said, resting his blade on his shoulder. Let's make haste back to Nora. We may be late. Taryn threw the box onto his horse and strapped it down tightly. Carl looked around, brow furrowed. They were on an old Roman road, its brick thick with moss and cracked by weeds. 2 strips of stone were in better condition than the rest, long traveled by foot, cart, and carriage. These stones were smooth and clean of weed. Woods pressed in from either side, long gnarled branches covered by moss and vine crowded in. Taryn had already started leading his horse back the way they came. Carl snatched up the dead vampire's horse's reins, looked hesitantly away from Taryn as he stared into the dark gloom of the night, the endless black beyond his lantern's light. Beneath the forest's canopy, not even the light of the moon pierced the black. Slowly, he turned and walked with Taryn. Carl heard it, the snap of the bowstring. He threw himself on Taryn, and the 2 of them slammed roughly onto the ground. Lanterns were uncovered, and men with cruel, vengeful faces stormed on thundering hooves down the road. They waved swords above their heads and screamed Wallachian battle cries. Carl leapt back up and hurled Taryn onto the dead vampire's horse. He followed by pulling himself up. An arrow hit his horse, and the beast screamed as the wood tore clean through the beast's rump. It hurtled forward. Taryn tried to follow, but the farm boy had difficulty getting the 2 horses he was responsible for to gallop forward. Carl whistled at the horses, and they started forward. The horses' hooves pounded deafeningly down the stones. The Wallachians' horses' breath blew hot on their backs. Carl's horse slowed as he struck about him. Blades flashed back and forth. Terran started to pull back, his horse healthy and fast. "Go!" cried Carl. The blades clashed, flashed in the dark. Carl took a blow on his shoulder. In exchange, he slew the man who reached him first. He yanked the dead man from his horse and slipped onto it. His breastplate rang as he made the mad maneuver. Carl spurred the horse on and gained a small portion of distance. The horse was faster than the others. Its sudden movement forward bought him space. Carl hunched low over the horse's neck. An arrow tore through his shoulder. It couldn't have been from a normal bow. Another shattered into a million pieces on the road. He pulled the horse to one side. "The woods, boy! Into the woods!" As the knight and his squire plunged recklessly into the woods, an arrow brutalized Carl's breastplate. The hardened steel dented and his ribs screamed as he almost fell off of his horse. Terran pushed Carl back onto his horse. Carl clutched desperately to the reins. His breath came hard, heavy, and with crinkling, cringing pain. Branches snagged at them and battered their limbs. Each blow threatened to take them from the saddle and to their doom. The bow thrummed, and arrows exploded, showering them with splinters. One of their lanterns caught on a branch and shattered. Flaming oil spilled onto the dry underbrush of the woods. Screams and shouts, smoke and the stench of burnt hair followed them. An arrow nicked off the side of Terran's head and sliced through the side of his horse's neck. The beast screamed and frothed with effort. Trees lurched out of the dark and grasped at them. Scrapes and splinters collected densely, and Terran was forced to unclasp his cloak. Soon his sweat was chilled by the night air, yet still they rode, fast and furious, through the woods. Carl slumped in his saddle, blood dripping from a dangling arm. Terran wove around tree after tree and barely reached the man before he fell. He wrapped Carl's cloak around the knight's stolen horse in a desperate gambit. A branch slammed into his head and he fell to the ground, dragging Carl with him. The calls of men and the beat of horses' hooves neared. The horses other than the one Nora's box was on had already run off with their last lantern. He retrieved the box and slapped the horse forward in the hopes he could hide behind a tree. The ancient, gnarled oak was wide as 3 men, and he hid amongst its roots as horsemen thundered by. He covered himself, Carl, and the box best he could in the black cloak of the house wallow. The light of lanterns bled through the black wool. Horses panted. Hooves clapped the ground. Men yelled and screamed. Terran pushed himself as deep as he could amongst the roots and prayed. Over the last week and a half, Nora had experimented with her regeneration. Some to Vickel's instruction, but most on her own. She also learned some medicine from Vickel. She helped with chores and did many of the physical jobs that had been in need of doing for probably 20 years. She had noticed what kind of woman Carl gave an extra glance to. She willed her growth in that direction. She also tried to strengthen her bones, to avoid breaking them as frequently. She stopped gaining height after that week, but she continued to change in other ways. She thickened around her chest and hips. She was starting to get hungry. Soon, trying to fuel her regeneration with her will caused her guts to scream in pain and exhaustion to rack her body. She tied herself to a thick post in the witch's hut, in the fear she would forget herself. The pain of almost tearing her arm off always brought her back to reality. She began to wither. Soon she couldn't pull her arm free with force. Then she was bedridden. Vickel worried over her. The old woman was always bustling about when Nora was awake. She wasn't frequently awake anymore. How long had it been? 2, 3 weeks? She scratched the post now and then to tell Taryn she was still alive. She knew it would make him feel better.